Chapter-1. Surrey County, England, 1867. Lady Camilla Worth had dreamed of marriage ever since she was 12 years of age and had been shunted off to the first family who reluctantly took her in. Marriage? She had quickly learned not to be persnickety in her choice of fantasies. It didn't have to be marriage. When she was younger, she had used to imagine that one of the girls whose acquaintance she made, however briefly, would become her devoted friend, and they would swear a lifelong loyalty to one another. When she lived in Gloucester, she daydreamed about becoming a companion. No, an almost granddaughter to an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down. "What would I ever do without you, Camilla?" old Mrs. Marsdell would say, after Camilla learned to crochet properly and thereby wormed her way into her heart. But old Mrs. Marsdell had never stopped frowning at Camilla suspiciously, no matter how well she crocheted, and Camilla had been packed up and sent off to another family before she had a chance to charm anyone. One person was all she had ever wanted. One person. Just one, who promised not to leave her. She didn't need love. She didn't need wealth. After packing her bags 9 times and boarding trains, braving swaying carts, or even once walking 7 miles with her aging valise in tow, after 9 separate residences, she would have settled for tolerance and a promise that she would at least have a place to stay. Of course, she also hoped for marriage as she grew older. Hope had always whispered sweet and promising words to her, and she always gave in. She stopped thinking of marriage the way children did, dreaming of white nights and declarations of undying adoration and houses to look over and china and linen to purchase. She hoped for it in the most basic possible terms. She wanted someone to choose her. She wanted not to be sent away again. Her husband didn't need to love her. He just needed to say, "We should stay together for the rest of our lives." Hope was forever beckoning, and having allowed herself to hope for so little, she had believed that surely she could not be disappointed. It just went to show. Fate had a sense of humor, and she was a capricious bitch. For here Camilla stood on her wedding day, wedding night, really. Her gown was not white, as Victoria's had been, and really shouldn't be called a gown, as tiny down feathers still clung to it from where she'd aired the bedding. Her hands were so dry they caught on the rough fabric of her apron. Her throat was parched. She had no trousseau packed in trunks. No idea what sort of home, if any, awaited her. She was getting married, and still her dream eluded her. Her groom's face was hidden in the shadows. Late as this wedding was on this particular night, a few candles lit in the nave did more to cast shadows than shed illumination. He adjusted his cuffs. The linen fabric gleamed white against the brown of his skin, and seemed whiter still when he folded his arms in disapproval. She couldn't see his full expression in the darkness, but his eyebrows made grim slashes of unhappy resignation. It might have been romantic, for versions of romantic that conflated foolhardy with fun, to marry a man she had known for scarcely 3 days. What Camilla knew of her groom was not terrible. He'd been kind to her. He had made her laugh. He had even, once, touched her arm and made her heart flutter. It might have been romantic, but for one not so little thing. "Adrian Hunter," Bishop Lassiter was saying, "do you take Camilla Winters to be your wife? Will you love her, comfort her, honor and protect her, and forsaking all others, be faithful to her, as long as you both shall live?" She would have overlooked the lack of a gown, a trousseau, almost anything. God knew she had given up hope of such luxury. She would have forgiven anything except— "No," said her groom. "Anything except this. Just like everyone else in the world, her intended didn't want her." The moment felt like a distant dream. It was happening to someone else. Someone very, very far away. Someone standing in Camilla's body and feeling Camilla's feelings. Behind Mr. Hunter, Rector Miles lifted the pistol. He didn't quite aim it at her reluctant groom. He held it askew, angled in the vague direction of the man in a way that managed to be a threat without quite amounting to a promise. His hands gleamed white on the barrel. The flickering light made his fingers look like maggots writhing on the tarnished steel. "That's not the way this is done," the rector said calmly. "You will agree, and you will sign the book, damn your eyes." "I do this under duress." His words sounded clipped and harsh. "I do not consent." Camilla couldn't even call him her intended. Intent on both their parts was woefully lacking. "I'm sorry," Camilla whispered. He didn't hear her. Or maybe he heard and didn't care to respond. She wouldn't have minded so much if he didn't love her. She didn't want white lace and wedding cake. But this wasn't marriage. Not really. She'd stayed with her uncle, then his cousins, then— well, she could recite the chain of people who had not wanted her around until her eyes stung and their faces blurred together. She'd been with Rector Miles longer than almost anyone, and she'd tried her hardest. She honestly had. This time, she had thought. This time she'd stay for certain. Instead, she was being wrapped up like an unwanted package again and sent on to the next soul. After being passed on, and on, and on, and on for all these years, she should have outgrown all illusions about the outcome in this case. The candlelight made Mr. Hunter's features seem even darker than they had appeared in the sun. In the sun, after all, he'd smiled at her. He didn't smile now. Camilla was finally getting married, and of course, her husband didn't want her. Her lungs felt too small. Her hands were shaking. Her corset wasn't laced tightly, but still she couldn't seem to breathe. Little green spots appeared before her eyes, dancing, whirling. "Don't faint, Camilla," she admonished herself. "Don't faint. If you faint, he might leave you behind, and then you'll truly have nowhere to go." She didn't faint. She managed to breathe, in and out, in and out. She said yes when it was her turn to do so, and the pistol never jerked in her direction. Eventually, the dizzying spots went away. She managed not to swoon on her way to sign the register. She did everything, except look at the unwilling groom, whose life had so forcibly been tied to her own. That was it. She was married. There were no congratulations. There was no wedding dinner. There was just that look in Rector Miles's eyes, the one that said Camilla deserved no better. She'd heard him say it often enough. She'd never let herself believe it. She took a deep breath and looked upward. She'd avoided thinking the worst of herself all this time. No point starting now. "Camilla?" Kitty, the other maid in the household, had been present to serve as a second witness. She reached for Camilla's hand as they passed. "I'm so—" But Rector Miles just glared at the woman. "Kitty was going to say that she packed your things. Your valise is outside." She followed him out into the night. It was late summer, but it had been unseasonably cold and rainy, and the wind still raged. The rectory was in the middle of wide, rolling pasture land, south of Surrey. A small collection of houses surrounded them, but it was 5 miles to the nearest town of any real size. An icy breeze whistled coldly down Camilla's neck, and she shivered. "There's an inn 3 miles away," Bishop Lassiter said. "They might allow you to take rooms for the night." Mr. Hunter made no response. The rector, who had given her a home for the last year and a half, did not even look at Camilla. He had told her earlier how disappointed he was in her behavior, and there was no chance for Camilla to speak with him now, because her new husband, without saying a word, shouldered his own bag and started walking down the road without her. That was how Camilla left the 10th household that had taken her in, on foot, at 9 at night, with a chill in the air and the moon high overhead. She picked up her valise, gritted her teeth, and did what she did best. She hoped. So, she had a new husband? Should she call him a husband? Maybe this would all work out. Just because it had never worked out yet didn't mean. She shook her head, coming to her senses. Daydreaming at a time like this? Mr. Hunter had started walking without so much as a glance at her, and he was now 10 yards distant. She was being left behind. Never mind what they could someday be to each other. Would he talk to her tonight? Would he want to consummate the marriage without even looking at her? Bile rose in her throat at the possibility. His long legs ate away at the ground. She scrambled to catch up. The handle of her valise began to burn a line in the palm of her hand. Switching shoulders, then trying to rest the weight against her hip, didn't help. She didn't dare complain. She didn't want to be left behind, not so soon. If she was abandoned again, in less than an hour, she had almost no money. She had no idea what she would do. Halfway to the inn, he stopped. At first, she thought he might finally address her. Instead, he let his own satchel fall to the ground. He looked up at the moon. His hands made fists at his side. Fuck. He spoke softly enough that she likely wasn't supposed to hear that epithet. Mr. Hunter. Finally, he turned to her. She still couldn't make out the expression in his eyes, but she could feel his gaze on her. He'd lost his position and gained a wife, all in the space of a few hours. She didn't imagine that he was happy with her existence, but acknowledging it was a start. He exhaled. I suppose this is what it is. We'll have to figure this mess out. That was what she was. Not a wife, not a companion. She was a mess. She inhaled once more and tried, desperately, to reach for the thing that had sustained her for years. Hope. She had never given up. She had never stopped trying. Her fingers tightened on her valise. She would make this work. She'd made everything work thus far, hadn't she? She'd just keep trying, harder this time, and... Camilla exhaled into the cold of the night. Hope felt very far away. How on earth had her life come to this? Ah, yes. It had started 3 days ago, when Bishop Lassiter had arrived on her doorstep with Mr. Hunter in tow. Chapter-2. It had started 7 days ago, when Adrian Hunter received a telegram from his uncle. The runner arrived just as Adrian sat down to breakfast with his brother. Adrian read the telegram once over coffee. He had a number of more pressing concerns, 8 of them to be precise. He had just approved the advertisement that announced that the world-famous Harville Industries would have a booth at the autumn exhibition to reveal their newest line of fine china. They would have new vases, new bowls, new everything. The pride and centerpiece of the collection, the advertisement boasted, would be a set of 8 enameled plates in gold leaf. This would have been exciting, except Harville did not yet have a design for 8 plates. It did not have a design for 1. Adrian and his team had not yet agreed upon an artistic course. In point of fact, the Harville artists had managed to accomplish precisely one thing with regards to those plates: argue. He didn't have time for his uncle's problem. But uncles were family, even if the uncle in question had yet to publicly acknowledge Adrian's existence. Adrian set the telegram to the side of his plate. This plate was one of the misadventures from a prior season, a review piece produced on too little sleep and too much artistic license. It featured a peacock with 2 heads and no tail. Adrian spread butter on his toast and considered. He read the words again as he ate a poached egg, sunlight spilling on the mahogany table. He read it a 3rd time as he sifted through the remainder of his correspondence. Mr. Alabi wanted him back in Harville. Mr. Singh had finished the roof repairs there. He set aside a letter about sourcing copper carbonate and looked up. His older brother was watching him with an impatience that he didn't bother to conceal. Grayson broke the 4th time Adrian picked up the telegram.
"For God's sake, what precisely does Uncle Dearest want now?"
"He requests my presence, as soon as I can be spared." Grayson's nose twitched. Adrian could remember what Grayson had been like before they'd been separated by bloodshed and the many leagues of the Atlantic Ocean. Grayson was 8 years his elder, but people had used to remark upon how similarly they looked. Same broad nose, same sparkling brown eyes alight with curiosity, same lips, same rich brown skin. Then war had come. Adrian's older brothers, Henry, Noah, Grayson, and John, had left to fight in a cause they all believed in. Grayson had been the only one to return. The change in him was nothing Adrian could easily put his finger on. His features were all still the same. It was just the way he used them that had changed for good. Right now, his elder brother scowled at him.
"Did Uncle Dearest use the word please by any chance?"
Adrian fought the urge to inspect the paper once again. Alas, he didn't need to.
"It's a telegram, Grayson. Every word is an expense, and frugality is a virtue." "Ah, I had not heard of our uncle's horrible reversal of fortune. Must be significant that he can no longer afford a halfpence for manners."
Adrian took another bite of his egg, in lieu of answering. Grayson sighed.
"You're going, then? You know Denmore only wants something from you."
His brother wasn't wrong. Adrian wasn't an idiot, and he knew their uncle better than Grayson. Their mother's brother was the Bishop of Gainshire. He was busy to a fault, dedicated to his work. Yes, he did use people, And yes, he had used Adrian in the past, but he used himself hardest, working long hours. It stung a little, the memory of the last time Denmore had seen Adrian. But it only stung a little, and Denmore was family. "I visited him regularly for 5 years," Adrian said mildly. "I do know him. Better than you do." Grayson snorted. "That's your gentle artist soul speaking there. You're too trusting." "You're too suspicious." Adrian smiled. "And I'm not an artist. Have you seen my attempts at sketching?" Grayson was not to be diverted. "He'll string you along with vague promises and you'll let him do it, because he's—" Grayson caught himself on these words and looked away, his hand curling into a fist. Grayson had never provided details of what had happened during the Great Rebellion back in the United States. Adrian had scoured the newspapers and the occasional letter avidly for news, but he only knew what anyone who hadn't participated knew, that after the southern states seceded, brother had fought brother, that blood had flowed, and bodies had piled up. He knew from letters that his brothers had sent that even among Northerners who didn't condone slavery, the black soldiers who joined their ranks had been ill-treated. 3 of his brothers had perished. Grayson had left looking like Adrian, and he'd come back like this, hard and untrusting, with a haunted look in his eye when he thought Adrian wasn't looking. Now Grayson reached across the table and took hold of the telegram without asking. He read it with a curl in his lip before tossing it aside. "Denmore would ask you for your heart without paying a halfpenny to say please. Whatever it is he wants of you, you don't need to give it." "I'm a grown man. I don't need to do anything." Grayson looked into Adrian's eyes across the table. There it was, that look, that sense Adrian had harbored for years that his brother had lost himself and still needed to be found. After a moment, his brother sighed. "You're going anyway. I don't want you to be hurt." Grayson looked away. "I just want to—" "Protect you," he didn't say, but Adrian could fill in the end of the sentence. Grayson had always looked out for him. If it had just been himself remaining of his family, maybe Adrian wouldn't have gone. He knew, after all, what his uncle was. Hell, he had spent most of his years in England. He wasn't a gentle artist soul, no matter what Grayson thought. It could be a hard, ugly world, especially for black men. Adrian had been spared the worst of it. He knew that. That made him feel more of an obligation, not less. "You don't need to look out for me," Adrian said mildly. Grayson shook his head, smiling. "Shut up, Sprout. That's my job. Don't you have work in any event?" Adrian had too much to do. He'd already put off his return too long. After Grayson left England this time, Adrian wouldn't see him for years to come. Every worker at Harville Industries depended on their continuing success. If they hadn't started producing plates in a month— "Say no," Grayson said. "You don't have time. God knows you've frittered enough of it away, staying with me while I oversee the cable laying contracts. You know Denmore." Adrian did. His uncle was flawed and self-centered, occasionally, but good still. Human, in other words. And Adrian knew Grayson, knew the scars he bore on his soul, the ones he refused to talk about. "Don't worry," Adrian said, with a half-smile. "I can take care of myself." Protecting an older brother was dangerous work. Grayson would never allow it, if he knew Adrian was attempting it. That just meant he needed to be all the more diligent about it. Adrian had been lucky, so lucky. He had lived. He'd been deemed too young to go to war. He'd had every advantage. Every time he thought, maybe I shouldn't, or maybe I don't have the time, he reminded himself how much he had. He always asked himself if maybe he could take on a little more. He always came to the same conclusion. Yes, he could manage more. Adrian could trust a little, could show his brother that he could loosen his hold on that hard knot of his suspicions. Their uncle was human, but he was a good man at heart. And maybe, if Adrian kept trusting, maybe one day he'd see Grayson smile the way he had used to. Grayson just sighed.
"Well, when he pretends he doesn't know you a second time, you'll undoubtedly be too upset for me to chastise properly. So I'll say now what I won't say then. He's already shown his true colors. What he did was unforgivable. And I can't believe you're giving him what is it now? A fourth chance? I told you so. You should have listened."
Adrian nodded.
"I'll save my speech for when we know the outcome."
Grayson just shook his head.
"Take care of yourself, little brother. I love you."
"I love you, too." Adrian stood. He reached out and set his hand on his brother's shoulder. A little more, he thought. He couldn't protect Grayson outright, but he'd trust where his brother couldn't. He'd trust a little more, and hopefully that would help.
"Mr. Adrian Hunter to see you, my lord."
All the reassuring words Adrian had spoken to his brother earlier that day were not enough to suppress his sense of disquiet at that introduction. The footman who conducted Adrian to the many-windowed room on the third floor, overlooking his uncle's grounds, no doubt thought nothing wrong with what he'd said. It was, after all, the truth. Just not all of it. Adrian had visited his uncle for months at a time, starting when he was 15. It had not been a planned sojourn. War had broken out back in America, and his entire family had been determined to help. Adrian had been deemed too young to fight. His father had told him that his part in the war effort would be to keep the portions of the family business that were in England running smoothly. His mother had given him another task. "Your charge is just as important," she had told him before she had boarded the ship. "Your uncle is a respected man. If you can change his mind, it will make a difference." It had not been just as important, he had later realized. His parents had wanted to make sure that at least one of their sons survived the conflict. Boys his age and younger had fought. It had all been a lie to keep him from doing anything stupid, like trying to join his brothers as they blockaded Confederate forces. During those years in England, Adrian had visited his uncle. Denmore, the Bishop of Gainsborough, had been unerringly kind in private. In private, he'd talked lovingly of Adrian's mother, his favourite sister, the sister whose loss he still mourned. In private, Adrian had asked why Denmore thought he had lost his sister when she was still alive and willing to speak to him, and had listened to the frank response. His uncle had provided Adrian with some incredibly valuable lessons in how English society functioned. One of those lessons was that being married to the wrong person was worse than being dead. Adrian hated it, but society wasn't kind, and his uncle hadn't tried to soften the blow. He'd taught Adrian to argue, to think, and to understand how the English thought in turn. He'd cried and hugged Adrian when Adrian, impatient and determined, had left his uncle's estate in order to take over his father's bewildering responsibilities at Harville. He'd embraced him every time he returned. All that loving affection had happened in private. In public, Adrian had been presented to all and sundry as first his uncle's sometime page, then his part-time amanuensis. In the 7 years since Adrian had first visited his uncle, Denmore had never so much as mentioned their familial relationship in public. He had not let his own servants know the truth, not by so much as a flicker of a smile in their presence. It had been 13 months since they had last seen each other, and still his uncle let no spark of joy light his expression at the sight of his nephew. He did not rise from his desk. That would break his public facade. Bishop Denmore would not show such affection for a man who had been a mere page. Instead, he inclined his head. "Mr. Hunter," he said calmly, "do come in. It's very good to see you. I'll be with you in a moment." The footman was still present. Adrian stood stiffly beside the door. He could hear Grayson's admonition in his head. "He's going to hurt you." Of course he was. Denmore annoyed Adrian every time they met by pretending they were not uncle and nephew. But Adrian could handle a little hurt if it eventually led to progress. For now, he inclined his head. "Bishop," he said instead. "Come, Mr. Hunter." His uncle raised an eyebrow. "After our long acquaintance, we need not stand on such ceremony. Call me Denmore and be done with it." Beside Adrian, the footman shifted uncomfortably. The request was a mark of familiarity. It would seem a kindness, an extraordinary condescension from a man of such exalted rank to a mere servant. The footman, his name was Walter Evans, believed Adrian didn't deserve such respect. Adrian knew this because he'd said so, repeatedly. "Know your place," Adrian had been admonished when he was younger. "Don't take advantage of the charity of a good man." "As you say, Bishop," Adrian said. Denmore sighed. "Well, Evans, close the door behind you. We've business to discuss." Adrian and the bishop remained in place, a stiff, awkward 10 feet distant. They waited until the door closed behind Evans, until they heard the servant's footsteps receding in the distance. Then, and only then, did the bishop stand. He crossed the room and pulled Adrian into an embrace. "Adrian," he said, "it's been too long." It had been more than a year, and it had been a long year. Bishop Denmore was almost a head shorter than Adrian. His wispy hair was white and textureless. His skin was paper-pale and creased with age, and he moved gingerly, evidence of his gout. It was hard to believe they were related. The bishop released him to an arm's length. "You're looking well, my boy." Adrian felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "I'm 22. I'm hardly a boy." "No." Denmore let go of his shoulders and gave him another appraising look. "No, you are not. You've grown to be so much more." Knowing they were uncle and nephew, not employer and employed, had left a mark. Denmore had pretended not to know Adrian, when they met by chance at an exhibition a year ago. He had, in fact, made an elaborate inquiry as to how a man like him had come to run a china works near Bristol, so that the friend who accompanied him would not guess at their relationship. The next time Adrian visited, he had given his uncle an ultimatum.
"Some day,"
his uncle had said sadly,
"I will. I promise."
Some day had not yet arrived. The bishop turned away.
"You've arrived not a moment too soon. You always seem to know precisely when I need you."
"That would be because you asked me to come." Over the last year, Adrian had had ample time to consider his situation in life. He knew how lucky he was. His family had money from their various business endeavors. His mother had inherited property, which had been added to his great-great-uncle's holdings. Adrian had a loving, overbearing brother and a massive extended family. He didn't need Denmore, not for anything. Still, he had asked Denmore for that one thing, and he'd asked for it repeatedly. He'd asked when he was 15, and when he was 16, and again for years and years. His uncle had never said no. He had always said later. Not now. Not now. Not with the war in America still raging. Not now. Denmore needed time to bring his older brother, the Duke, into the scheme. Not now. Denmore was being considered for elevation to bishop, and he could do so much more once he was appointed. Not now. He was too new in his position. He did not dare make waves. Not now. Not now. But someday he had promised. Of course the time would come someday. "So," Adrian said, eyeing his uncle, "last time we talked, I asked you to acknowledge my family. My mother, me, my brother. Is it time yet?" His uncle smiled slowly. "It's time." Oh, thank God. Adrian could just imagine the look on Grayson's face when he brought this news back. He could not hold back his delighted smile. He felt as if his whole face would crack with joy. He hadn't precisely been estranged from his uncle this last year over this very issue, but he'd pulled back. He hadn't visited. His letters had been a little cold. He hated being cold. "I always said the time would come," his uncle said, patting Adrian's hand. "I always said I would acknowledge you one day, and never mind the consequences. You know I love you, do you not?" Adrian's nose twitched on that word, consequences. They hadn't really argued about consequences last time. When he'd been his uncle's amanuensis/nephew in hiding, he had needed to construct arguments in letters on his uncle's behalf. Denmore had taught him to hide his passion behind rational argument. Adrian always tried to meet people on the ground they knew best. Last time Adrian had met his uncle, they had debated the matter as if it were a question set before Parliament, and they were indifferent observers hashing out the benefits and detriments. "So," Adrian folded his arms. He imagined the rationality, his uncle preferred, settling over his shoulders like a cloak, hiding the furious joy that threatened to break through his calm. "How have you planned the announcement? Have you consulted with your brother the Duke yet?" "Ah," Denmore blinked. "Will you tell them that your sister did not perish, as your father claimed so many years ago?" Adrian had thought about this for so long. He had so many ideas as to how to proceed. Or would you rather start by introducing my father and brother? I know you worry about the connection with trade, but the trade my family engages in is of a particularly honourable sort. My father is a respectable gentleman who has devoted his life to a just cause. Adrian. Ah, he hadn't sufficiently hidden his enthusiasm. Adrian bit back his excitement. There is no way to soften the blow our family's reputation will suffer when the news is out, his uncle said. A duke's daughter ran off with a black abolitionist 35 years ago. My father told everyone she was dead rather than admit the truth. It will be a scandal no matter how it's announced. Adrian took a deep breath. No point getting angry at the truth, even if his own uncle was the one saying it in that way. Except it was not entirely the truth. My mother did not run off, Adrian said mildly. My mother was a widow. It took my parents 3 years working together on the matter of abolition before they decided to marry, which they did legally, properly. Rational. That was the way to convince his uncle. You of all people know it matters how an issue is presented. My mother married a man who cared about a cause. How does that pose a problem? It won't matter that they were married. As for my father, nor that your father was a man of property. That's not the point. Adrian lived in his own skin, damn it. His father could have been supreme emperor of the entire world for all that British society cared. The fact that his father was black would be a scandal, no matter how it was laid out. He knew that, but still. I know it won't matter to some people, but it should. And if we are to have any chance of changing the way things are, we must talk of my parents as people first. His uncle just looked at him briefly, then turned away. From his uncle's point of view, this must seem a frightening step. It hurt a little, that this man, who had been so kind, still saw Adrian as an object of fear, and not just a nephew. But Adrian had been lucky in his life. He could handle a little more personal hurt, if it led to the right result. His uncle had agreed to acknowledge him, and that was a good step forward. Adrian could acknowledge the hurt once the joy had come. Very well, then. If you decided to do it, then it's a matter of accepting the consequences as inevitable. I suppose Lassiter is no longer a problem. Bishop Lassiter was his uncle's rival in the church. He had been Denmore's excuse for the last 2 years. There was no rivalry so bitter as one between 2 men equal in rank and seniority, who opposed each other on every principle. Adrian's uncle brightened. I'm so glad you mentioned him. That's the very thing I need to discuss with you. He won't be a problem soon. Adrian looked over. There was a light in his uncle's eyes. His uncle leaned in excitedly. Do you, by any chance, recall that favour you did for me on accident several years ago? No, Adrian said swiftly. No, he wouldn't do it, he meant. But his uncle took it as simple denial. When those men took you for a servant and divulged those very embarrassing details in your presence? Well. His uncle slipped a piece of paper across the table with a self-satisfied smile. Here, he said, Lassiter is advertising for a valet. It took Adrian a moment to process those words, to understand what his uncle was asking him to do. He shook his head. Impossible.
I've taken the liberty of obtaining references on your behalf, the man said, as if Adrian had spoken of a practical impossibility, instead of the fact that his soul rebelled against the thought of entering service to spy on another man. Lassiter won't connect the letters to me at all, and there's a fashion for black servants in London at the moment. Lassiter is vain enough to indulge. Adrian turned his head away as much as he could without being rude. I could not possibly pose as a valet. My Henry will give you tips, his uncle said, and you won't need to fool Lassiter for long. You're so bright. You'll pick up anything you need to know in no time at all. No, absolutely not. You don't have faith in your own intelligence. It's not that. It's this. I'm not a servant. And I really don't like lying. Of course you aren't. I'm not asking you to be one. I'm just asking you to pose as one. Be rational about this, Adrian. Rational. It was always rationality with Denmore, and the word was only brought out when his uncle proposed something that left a bad taste in Adrian's mouth. I have business that requires my attention, Adrian said. It was not a lie. He had 4 weeks until production had to start on his series of plates, and there were still no designs. Isn't Grayson around now? He can handle it. Yes, but Grayson has no artistic sense, Adrian didn't say, because it was one thing to make fun of your brother to his face, and another entirely to do it to someone outside the immediate family. But Grayson is only in England because he's overseeing the final production of the cable-laying ship and securing the contracts for the business to proceed. He hasn't time to handle what is going on at Harville, too. Is your business worth more than knowing that the Church of England is led by men of good character? I know Lassiter's doing something. I even have some idea as to what it is. He has a little too much money, and he has explained it by claiming excessively lucky investments for too long. Adrian shook his head. Denmore nodded, as if he heard everything Adrian wasn't saying. I know it's a great deal to ask of you. I know how lowering it must feel for you. But it's no more than you ask of me. If I could diminish Lassiter's influence, I could choose to lower myself and accept you. Accepting me is not lowering. Adrian took another deep breath. He loved his uncle. He loved his uncle. Still, sometimes he didn't like him much. For a moment, his emotions rose in his throat. Years ago, his mother had charged him with changing his uncle's mind, to bringing him around to the cause. He has influence in the church, she said, and think what it would mean if he used it properly. Grayson openly scoffed at his uncle's claims that someday he would acknowledge their branch of the family. Grayson, who had no trust any longer. Adrian had always wanted to believe that his uncle, the uncle who had been so kind in private, could become the sort of man who would be kind in public too. I told you so, he could hear Grayson saying when he returned with this tale. I should hope, his uncle said, that you would love me as much as I have loved you. I do, Adrian said, annoyed, but he didn't have a good argument. Not the kind Denmore could listen to, at any rate. His love felt like a chain wrapped round his neck, yanking him in line. If you love me, his uncle wheedled, do this one thing for me. Not even for me. Do it for yourself. Do this one thing, and I'll acknowledge you. I promise. That's... You should.
But Adrian knew there was no use arguing. There had never been any point in arguing. Don't tie these things together, Adrian wanted to say. It makes me feel sick. But feeling sick was an emotion, not an argument. His uncle wouldn't listen. Don't ask this of me. You've hurt me enough. Emotion, not argument. Don't use me this way. Don't use me at all. He had no arguments, only emotions. Adrian knew his uncle. If he said no now, his uncle would take it as proof that he had never wanted acknowledgement. Not really. Adrian could remember lying in bed at the age of 15 and dreaming that his uncle would take Evans aside and just tell him, "Don't treat him like that. He's my nephew, not my charity case." It hurt, what his uncle was asking of him. But Adrian had been hurt so little, and others had been hurt so much. If he could make a difference. He wanted Grayson to know that people could change, that a little trust would not go amiss. Here was his chance to have that. He would do anything for his brother, even this. "If I do this, you must promise not to back away. Not this time." "Of course not." The bishop looked utterly shocked. "I would never. It will be over before you know it, and we'll greet the world with joy together." Right. The word tasted sour on Adrian's tongue, but this was what he'd wanted. Recognition. Grayson. The part that hurt would be over soon enough, and once it was past, Adrian wouldn't need to think of it again. "Joy," he said carefully. "I look forward to that." Adrian had to tell Grayson something, he thought. Something short. Eventually he settled on sending him a letter, one with no return address. "I will be a while," he wrote. "A week, possibly more. Will return to Harville after to finish the designs. I'll explain when it's all finished." He did not know how to end his missive. Anything he could add sounded foolish. "Don't tell me so yet," he finally wrote. "Not until all is said and done. It will all turn out beautifully, I'm sure." He wished he felt as sure as he pretended. He provided no return direction. He didn't want Grayson to know what he was doing after all. To Mr. Alabi at Harville Industries, he sent another letter. "Another business matter has arisen. You all have never needed me anyway. We'll finalize designs when I arrive in 2 weeks. There won't be a moment to spare. Thanks for your understanding." And that was how it started for Adrian. The week before the wedding, with a mistake and a promise. Chapter 3. For Camilla, it started 3 days before the wedding, on a Monday, with another mistake. It was already 2:30, and it would have been nice if someone had told the household staff that guests would be arriving that day. Warning, given a week ago, would have been preferable. Even notice provided yesterday would have been acceptable. For God's sake, a hint this morning at breakfast would have been better than what had actually happened, which was that the carriage pulled up outside just as Camilla was serving pudding at lunch. Rector Miles had jumped up from the table. "Right!" He'd smiled broadly. "Bishop Lassiter is here now. Is everything in readiness?" Nothing had been in readiness. The sheets in the spare room had not been aired. No particular plans had been laid for supper, except a course of roast chicken and rolls. The household had erupted into chaos, and Camilla had not had a moment to think in the time that followed. "Camilla!" Kitty was saying as Camilla dashed up the stairs, staggering under her load of linen. "Camilla, why are the extra servants' beds not made up yet? I asked you 3 hours ago." Kitty was not the housekeeper. She was just another maid-of-all-work like Camilla, but she had been around longer than Camilla, and so took it upon herself to order Camilla about when she had the chance. "'Cause they're not," Camilla answered shortly. "But they will be. See that they are. Then come help me polish the silver. It'll be needed for tonight. Think how it will reflect on us if so much as a single fork has spots. It won't. Pardon? It won't." Camilla popped the door to the male servants' room open with her hip. "It won't reflect. If there's spots. There will be no reflection." No response. Thank God Kitty had not heard that dubious attempt at humour. Camilla shook out a sheet and wrangled it into place with a practised air. When she'd been young and in an entirely different situation, she'd dreamed of marrying well and running a household far larger than this one. That had obviously not happened, and there was no point looking back to bemoan could-have-beens. But she could put on a square sheet, tight and perfect, in 40 seconds flat. It wasn't much to be proud of, but then Camilla found her pride where she could. It was nice to be good at something. She reached for the second sheet. "Camilla!" Cook's call drifted up the servants' stairs. "Camilla! You're needed now! Someone must bring the tea in for the bishop, and you're the only one with the manners for it. 1 minute!" She shook out her sheet. "No minutes! Now!" Sheets, silver, serving, all of which had to be done now, because the rector hadn't had the decency to inform his staff of an impending visit. Camilla slammed the sheets down and growled, "I don't have time for this shite." "Who does?" It was an amused voice behind her, an unfamiliar voice, a man's voice, and since this was the male servants' room, perhaps she should not have been so surprised. Still, she jumped, startled. The man who stood in the doorway was utterly striking. He was tall and dressed in dark blue with contrasting crisp white linen. He was African, or no, probably not that, Camilla amended, thinking of his voice. He'd sounded very British. Just 2 words, and she could hear a hint of West Country in his accent. Those vowels reminded her of the years she'd spent in Bath when she was 15. The other girls had laughed at her then, saying Camilla was putting on airs with her language. She had tried to sound like them. When Camilla had been dragged to the other side of the country after that, her new compatriots had laughed at her and told her she sounded like a country bumpkin. This man just sounded friendly. He was watching her with a smile. Funny how much more striking that contrast of crisp linen was with his brown skin than it would have been for a white man. He made everyone else seem utterly pallid by comparison. She'd seen black people before, servants and sailors and speakers. She'd never cursed in front of one until now. Camilla had always blushed easily. She felt her cheeks flame. How utterly uncouth he must think her. She swallowed. "Just now. You may have heard—" He looked visibly amused. "I'm absolutely positive that I heard you say, 'I don't have time for this trite.'" He trailed off, gesturing. She couldn't help herself. It was just a little kindness, to pretend he hadn't heard her. But little kindnesses were still kindness. She couldn't help herself. She smiled. "Oh, is that what I said? Of course. I don't have time for this trite. But now I'm confused. That's not a complete sentence. This trite what?"
"You didn't say."
Maybe it was because his eyes sparkled. Maybe it was because Camilla had always bloomed under any sort of attention. Maybe it was because she'd been working furiously without so much as a half-second to breathe for the last hour. But she found herself blushing again. "It doesn't sound much like me." She met his eyes, aware that speaking like this was a bit too forward. She was too tired to care. "I'll have you know that I usually end my sentences with nouns when it's called for. You must think me entirely ungrammatical. We can't have that." "Ah," he shrugged. "I assume you would have finished what you were saying had I not interrupted you. The fault is all mine." "If you had not interrupted me," Camilla continued, "you would have heard me say, 'I don't have time for this trite bullshit.' Uncouth, forward, impatient. Everyone always counselled Camilla to hide what she was. She'd never been able to do it properly. If this man hated her, best he discover it quickly, before her imagination caught fire, and she let herself get hurt with her own expectations. But instead of backing away, he actually laughed at this, his eyes crinkling up in a way that made her smile back at him. "If you haven't guessed from Cook's shouting," she said, "I'm Camilla. That's Miss—" Worth, she did not say. It had been more than a year since she introduced herself by her real name. She couldn't be Camilla Worth any more. Camilla Worth would be an embarrassment to her family. "Winters," she finished. "Miss Winters to you."
"Mr.
He paused, imitating the way Camilla had drawn out her fake name.
Hunter. His Grace's valet."
A valet? To a bishop? Well above her current station, she reminded herself, and she had best remember not to be foolish. She really needed to get away before Mr. Hunter made her smile again.
"But I look forward to speaking with you,"
he said, and he sounded as if he meant it. Camilla always got carried away with herself. It was her worst flaw, in what was undoubtedly an unending sea of unmendable flaws. She wanted so badly to be wanted. She'd been told again and again to stop, to have some decorum, and she rarely managed it. Likely she never would. There was nothing particularly appreciative about the glances Mr. Hunter gave her. She should not allow herself to imagine that his gaze actually lingered on her. For heaven's sake, she was the only thing in the room. What else was he to look at? Still, he smiled at her one last time, and she couldn't help but smile back. He was a valet to a bishop. That put him far above her station, and he was too handsome for her anyway. Besides, how long would he stay? Days at best. It was foolish to imagine that a little conversation was akin to flirtation, but Camilla had been foolish before. Her glance, she knew, was possibly a little too familiar. "Unlikely. We'll never speak again. I will perish from overwork before we have a chance to exchange another word." There it was again. She was flirting. "I'll be back to finish the sheets," she said, because talking of beds would definitely make the situation better. "When I die, make sure that Kitty gets my wire brooch. She's admired it so.
I'll make up the beds.
You're too kind.
No, he said with a twinkle in his eye. You don't understand. If you perish, I'll have to get the bishop's formal blacks ready for the funeral. It's far less work to just finish the sheets.
He wasn't flirting, she reminded herself firmly. That sparkle in his eyes didn't mean anything. In that case, she said, I'll leave you to it. And maybe we can have that word later. He smiled.
Maybe we can.
God, Camilla was an idiot. She had a moment to look up, dazedly, into his eyes. They were brown, flecked with gold, and when he smiled, it felt as if the whole world was smiling with him. Idiocy. It took a particular sort of perverse obstinacy to fall in love at first sight. It took absolute pig-headedness to do it again, and again, and again. To imagine affection from nothing, and then hope for it repeatedly. It was, in short, Camilla's usual rebelliousness to believe, after all this time, that someone would like her. It wasn't the first time she'd been taken with someone, simply because he was kind and handsome and a stranger. None of the people familiar with her liked her at all. It would have to be a stranger who decided she was worth something, if it were ever to happen. And it had been so long. Her chance had to come up.
Camilla! Tea! Now!
The shriek up the stairs jolted her out of her state of daydreaming. Camilla jumped and ducked her head. That is...
Goodbye, Miss Winters,
he said softly. She shouldn't. She really should not. Au revoir, Mr. Hunter. She could not help her hopeful smile, the lift in her heart. She could not help grinning as she ran down the stairs. He was only going to be here for a short time. Then he'd leave. Besides, if he was employed by a bishop, he had to have an impeccable character. She was flighty, flirty, and terribly good at fooling herself. Camilla knew this about herself. She'd learned it all too well. But a few hours, maybe a few days. How could it hurt her to be happy for a few days? 5 minutes later, Camilla ducked into the rector's office, where the two men were ensconced deep in conversation. Summer sun was shining through the window, laying a cross-hatched pattern on the surface of Rector Miles's desk. She set the large tray there, then gathered up the teapot.
As far as charity works for the parish,
Rector Miles was saying,
I honestly cannot imagine doing more than we are doing at the moment.
Camilla did not think much of the rector's plans for charity. It was flaw number 49 in her, she supposed, a tendency to judge others when she had more than her own share of defects to correct. She tried not to judge, a little bit, but alas, that would no doubt be engraved on her tombstone. Camilla tried to be good, but not for very long. It was particularly hard for Camilla not to judge Rector Miles on the matter of charity, though. She and Kitty were both his charity projects, and while she did see some charity in his actions, she was still essentially an underpaid servant. She knew she should be grateful to him, but—
No, the bishop replied. I've seen what you do, and there is no benefit in devoting any more funds to the matter.
Camilla was grateful to Rector Miles. She was. She had been in trouble when he rescued her. He'd made her see all the possible consequences of her behavior. He'd taken her in, and he patiently spent time thinking of her. No point returning to what she had been. She'd made a mistake, several mistakes, but she was trying to do better. She'd focus on that.
Then we are agreed.
The two men nodded at each other. Camilla set spoons and saucers down, aligning them precisely, then arranged the little ceramic dishes of milk and sugar between them. It had not been trouble that the rector had saved her from. At least, it had not been immediate danger, just the kind that put her immortal soul in peril, even if it had made her mortal being temporarily happy.
I've been thinking of the best way to handle the situation,
Rector Miles was saying.
It could potentially become a larger issue.
Mr. Hunter had seemed kind. Just thinking of a man's shoulders could not endanger her mortal soul, could it? They were just shoulders. Shoulders were above the waistline, far above the waistline. Surely it would be entirely innocent to think of them. Would it not? Camilla fetched the sugar biscuits and set them above the tea things.
And here I thought the matter was already decided, the bishop said.
The tea tray had been laden with treats today, but who had put it together, Camilla didn't know. One didn't serve sandwiches tossed higgledy-piggledy on a plate to a bishop. She shook her head and arranged them into a spiraling star. The bishop was right, even if he hadn't been addressing Camilla. She'd already made her decision. She was trying to be good. She didn't want to have to think of her mistakes, and that meant no flirtations, no shoulders, no nothing. Down that path lay danger to her immortal soul. If she were a better person, she'd accept what she ought to be with a glad heart. But there were times Camilla quite resented her immortal soul. Sometimes Rector Miles spoke of the conflict between good and evil, as if an angel and a devil stood, one on each shoulder, whispering suggestions. For whatever reason, Camilla had been assigned an entire regiment of devils, and her angel was, at best, defective. Still, it tried its best.
There will always be people who donate to the church,
Bishop Lassiter was saying.
They'll do so loudly, to appear virtuous to those around them. Mrs. Martin is no different. Trouble is always possible, but we should handle her as we have all the others.
It was sobering. Camilla had to find her virtue elsewhere, in overheard conversations, perhaps. Camilla laid the scones in a straight line and made sure the jam and clotted cream had not spilled from their containers. Trouble was always possible, and here she was, trying to justify her choices once again.
But,
Rector Miles said,
she's demanding. Don't give in.
That was what Camilla had to remember. Her first impulse was wicked, her second no better. She usually didn't start questioning if she was on the right path until 10 minutes later, when she'd already made a fool of herself. At least now she was questioning what she was doing, even if it took her some time. That was improvement, was it not? She had just met Mr. Hunter. She had no business flirting with him. One last check of the little cakes, and she nodded.
We have official policy in place precisely for times such as these, Bishop Lassiter said. We cannot disclose the information she requests for reasons of parishioner privacy. It's that simple.
Camilla set the tray of sandwiches in front of the men with a flourish. Bishop Lassiter stared at the silver tray, at the attractive display of sandwiches, then raised his head to contemplate her. He blinked and frowned, as if seeing her for the first time.
Girl, what are you doing here?
Me? Camilla had thought that putting out tea things was self-explanatory. Sandwiches, Your Grace?
She's just laying out the tea, Lassiter, Rector Miles said. The bishop glared at Camilla, as if she'd done something terribly wrong, as if he could intuit the legion of demons on her shoulder, urging her on to sin.
"Oh, look," whispered one of those demons. "Here's a man you have no inclination to flirt with. How bad can you be?" Horrible. She was absolutely horrible. Camilla ducked her head to hide her wicked smile. "My apologies."
Camilla,
Rector Miles said a little harshly.
I think you have enough to do without dawdling over the scones. Get on with you.
"Yes, of course." She curtsied again, then darted away. Stupid devils. She was going to be good. So good. All she had to do was not flirt for the next few days. How hard could that be? The servants' table at dinner was a crowded affair. It did not bring back Adrian's happiest memories to be seated at benches below stairs, the air smelling of onions and yeast, packed thigh to thigh with the other servants. The looks the other servants gave him were all too familiar. Uncertain at best, suspicious at worst. The questions were no better. "Where are you from?" The footman who asked was unwilling to accept Bristol as the answer, even though it was the truth. The fact that Adrian was, essentially, lying about his family made the endeavour even more fraught. He had never been particularly good at lying. The faster Adrian figured out what Lassiter was about, the sooner he could drop this stupid disguise and get back to his life. It was, as his uncle had said, something to do with money. He was sure of it now. It was always something to do with money. Money made idiots of men. The money didn't make sense in Rector Miles's household either, and that always set off little alarms ringing in his head. 2 maids, a housekeeper, a cook, 2 footmen. That was an utterly massive staff for a single widowed rector. Then there was the china upstairs. The sheets, brand new everywhere, turned just once, even for the servants. The food.
My apologies, the cook was saying. It's nothing but potatoes and cheese. We'd no notice of visitors, and this was the best I could manage.
Who apologized for potatoes and cheese?
"I've had far worse," Adrian said, "at far superior households."
True.
"Well,"
muttered one of the rector's servants,
"that's no surprise, as—"
The woman he'd met earlier, Miss Winters, thumped the man on the arm with a metal spoon. "Don't be an ass, Sultan." The cook gave Miss Winters a slightly less casual tap with her spoon.
"Don't use language like that, Camilla. Not around guests. Whatever will the bishop's men think of us?"
Adrian had made it a point to settle on the bench just opposite the delightful Miss Winters. She was pretty. Dark hair that he suspected would fall in waves if she ever let it down from that white cap, and eyes that twinkled, even though she was trying to look demure. She even had a little colour to her skin, as if she weren't afraid of sun. He would have sat near her, even if he wasn't searching for information. As it was, she'd proven talkative earlier, and gossip was the best place to start.
"I mean it,"
Adrian said, shifting in place.
"I visited deans who set a worse table, and who had not so fine a staff. You must all be very proud."
Gossip was a delicate business, and Adrian didn't usually indulge. Still, even the most loyal, closed-mouthed servants, the ones who would never speak an ill word, would not hesitate to boast of their employer out of pride. Wouldn't they? "It's because Camilla is half price," said a maid across the table from him. "She's inexpensive because—" Miss Winters flushed red and jabbed an elbow into the woman's side. "Kitty!" "The rector came into a little money some years back," the cook said. "His aunt or some such. I hadn't the details, but he's able to do the household proud, far beyond a rector's means." Maybe the answer was just that prosaic. Adrian doubted it. He probed a little deeper. "Certainly there's no need for apologies as to the fare. Why, the bishop received a telegram just yesterday and rushed here immediately. You must have had no notice to speak of." "None," moaned the woman who had been called Kitty. She was willow-thin and white-capped, and half again as old as Miss Winters. "We had no idea you were coming until everyone arrived just after noon." "I wonder what all the commotion could be about," Adrian said, hoping he sounded idly curious. "What could occasion such a swift arrival?" "Well, if anyone knows it's Camilla," Kitty said. "She brings the rector his tea, 'cause her soul is most in need of his prayers." Miss Winters' eyes narrowed. She bit her lip, looked at Adrian, and blushed. Then she shook her head and applied herself to her potato. "In this instance, I know nothing." He was getting quite the idea of Miss Winters. He could just imagine. She was young enough that she should have had a family to pray for her soul, not a rector who employed her at half price, had they said? Likely she was an orphan being taught a trade, so they would say, and she was told to be grateful for anything she could get. Her parents had no doubt been in debt, or some such, and her employment, at half wages, good Lord, had been presented to her as charity, not avarice. Adrian had seen it often enough. Alas, this was business as usual, not a scandal, and even if it had been a scandal, it was the rector's, not Lassiter's. Adrian wasn't here to convince maids to demand a full salary. "You may not know, Miss Winters," he said to her across the table, "but perhaps you would speculate. I imagine you're good at piecing together a story." Their eyes met over the table, and Miss Winters flushed again. Adrian had pegged her about a minute after meeting her. She was young enough to still have dreams, and lonely enough that she'd attach them to anyone who was kind to her. A smile, a slight hint of preference, and she'd tell him anything he asked. Her eyes met his. There was a hopeless glow in them. She licked her lips, as if she had suddenly become aware of her mouth. Adrian tried not to think of his in return. She seemed susceptible enough to kindness, and he didn't need complications. He was bad at lying as it was. If he let himself think too much about how pretty she was, his preference would show. He didn't need to make her feel uncomfortable. But Miss Winters, blush and all, just shook her head and looked away, smoothing her skirts. "No," she said quietly. "I could speculate, but I shouldn't. I have nothing interesting to add." "Good for you," the cook said. "You don't want to be half-price Camilla forever, do you?" Her eyes flashed. My God, that appellation. Half-price Camilla. Adrian knew too well how unkind servants could be. Those who had little always wanted to shout to the rooftops that someone else had less.
He'd been put in his place often enough that he knew what it looked like. He could track her rebellion by the pink splotches rising on her neck, the thinning of her lips, the way her shoulder blades drew up, tight and full of tension. He almost thought she would burst with the effort of holding in her response. But she didn't. That light in her eyes faltered. She looked down and took another bite. Oh, damn! Adrian had met people, men and women, who had had their hopes crushed right out of them. He'd known youths who still had their heads in the clouds. This was the first time he'd seen someone in the process of getting crushed. You know, he thought idly, perhaps it would not hurt if I said a word to her. But no, he had so much to do as it was. He needed to be back at Harville within a week. Sooner would be better. It rubbed him the wrong way to stay silent, but this entire endeavour rubbed him the wrong way. She couldn't be his concern. Either she had useful information or she didn't. Miss Winters didn't look at him again during the meal. She didn't look at him so assiduously that he twice saw her on the brink of looking and colouring before turning away again. He shouldn't care. But as he finished his potato, he wondered how long it took to crush a woman's spirit, and if there was anything to be done about it. At the end of the meal, when she was standing up and clearing the table, he offered to help gather the plates. She turned toward him, head down, hands full with the breadbasket. "You're kind." It sounded like an accusation when she spoke. She shook her head, as if dispelling a dream. "You're very kind," she said again, "and I don't need it. But thank you." The day had been long, and Camilla had tried so hard to be good. She had not flirted over dinner, not even when Mr. Hunter had almost made her laugh 4 times. It was unfair that she should run into him on the stairs, after she'd finished the dishes and banked the fires for the night. Entirely unfair. And since he had undoubtedly dressed the bishop for the evening, extremely understandable. "Miss Winters?" He nodded at her. It was an open stairway. She was a maid-of-all-work. There was nothing wrong with wishing him a good night. She did so to the other male servants all the time. Nothing, except she'd have to look him in the eyes, and no matter what her single, overworked angel told her, she still liked him. She could feel the beat of her pulse in her wrist, just because she stood close to him. She kept her head down, nodded in his direction, and turned to go into the room shared by the female servants. "Oh, no," he said softly behind her. "It happened." Before she could think, she turned to him. Oh, a terrible idea, that. He was still handsome, and a stranger, and with only the one guttering oil lamp standing at the head of the stairs, he seemed mysterious and enticing to boot. Golden shadows glittered across his skin. Camilla set one hand over her belly to quiet a sudden riot of butterflies. "What happened?" He smiled at her. "You perished after all." It took her a moment to remember their earlier conversation, the one where she'd flirted with him by claiming death. Oh, excellent work, Camilla. She had only felt dead earlier. She came to life under his perusal, as if she were a parched plant drinking the first rain after a drought. "I did," Camilla said slowly. "I am a walking corpse, shambling about the countryside." Damn, damn, damn! She was doing it again. She was flirting, awkwardly, with talk of walking corpses, but no matter how badly she was doing it, she was still flirting.
"Does Kitty get your wire brooch, then?"
He recalled their conversation. He'd paid attention to her. She felt another burst of warmth. No, she couldn't give in. Memory, she scolded herself, was not affection. She was not going to fall in love, not again. She was going to be good. But he had remembered. Camilla exhaled and looked over her shoulder at the servants' beds laid out in a row. Kitty was already under the covers. Cook would be up shortly. No. Camilla shook her head. I am a jealous corpse. If she took it, I'd rise from the grave and do hateful things to her. He smiled as if she'd made a joke, probably because she had. Well, he nodded to the room behind him. Rest in peace, then. I'm glad I got to meet you before you passed away. He tapped her arm, ever so slightly. It was just a friendly gesture, but still her heart leapt. God, she wanted so much more than the brush of a finger. She felt absolutely starved for touch. But Camilla knew how these things went, these little flirtations. One went from trading witticisms and smiles to trading more. She was half-price Camilla because of that more. She didn't fool herself either. She wasn't good. She never would be. But if she pretended hard enough, maybe she'd eventually fool everyone else. She bit her cheeks to hide her smile. Good night, he said. And because she wasn't good, she could feel her heart thump in reply. Sleep well, she offered tentatively. His eyes met hers one last time, and she thought of all that sleep entailed, beds and removal of clothing, and vulnerability. Her cold covers awaited her, and for a moment a thread of unadulterated loneliness rose up inside her, twining cold tendrils around her heart. Sleep well, she said again, and retreated as best she could. Chapter 4. Thankfully, Camilla didn't encounter him the next morning. She made plans. Good plans. Sober plans. To maintain a reasonable distance, with no swearing, or flirting, or talk of shambling corpses at all. Still, she felt sore and raw all day. That haunting feeling of loneliness from last night had not abandoned her. She was more aware than ever that her heart ached. Maybe it was because she'd spent all yesterday tearing up and down stairs, carrying sheets and polishing silver until her arms ached. Maybe it was because of the way Mr. Hunter had looked at her the prior evening, with pity, as if he could see through Camilla's attempts to be good, and knew how little chance she had of succeeding. For whatever reason, she felt particularly low when she slunk into the rector's study that afternoon with the tea things.
"There are rumours that Shoreham is stepping down,"
the bishop was saying,
"and you've positioned yourself perfectly to—"
The conversation stopped as the plates on her tray clinked, drawing the men's attention. They looked up at her, as if irritated at the intrusion. Camilla bowed her head and laid everything in place as quickly and silently as possible. Toast points, tea, milk, sugar, lemon tarts. Her fingers lingered a second on the dish of tarts. She had loved lemon tarts once. No, She wasn't going to look back at a time when she'd had them regularly herself. She didn't think she could eat one any longer.
"Miss Winters,"
said the bishop. Camilla jumped, yanking her hand away. "My apologies. My most abject apologies." One moment. One little lapse of judgment, and there she was, straying into dangerous territory, dreaming, remembering. His frown deepened at this.
"What are you apologizing for?"
"For taking so long." He blinked.
"Well, don't do that, then. I've been told that you are not, in fact, Miss Camilla Winters."
Camilla swallowed.
"That your name is Miss Camilla Worth."
It was, to be technical, Lady Camilla Worth, but after all that had happened to her, insisting on her title would do more harm than good. She couldn't get above herself. She didn't dare reveal the truth. She didn't answer this query with anything more than a nod. Her heart pounded heavily in her chest.
"That's an interesting family name."
She would not say a word.
"It's the family name of the late Earl of Linney,"
he said, examining his fingernails.
"The one who was executed for treason a handful of years ago."
9 years ago it had been. Camilla tried not to think of the date, but she remembered it too perfectly. Almost half of Camilla's life, if that barely remembered past really belonged to her. Her father was dead and a traitor. Her brother was dead and transported. Next to them, Camilla's sins were merely banal. Camilla knew she should hate her father for what he had done, to her family, to the country. But the very thought of him, her brothers, her sisters, opened up that cavern of loneliness in her heart. She'd never been good at hating anyone. No, don't look back. Is that right? She glanced at the rector who was watching her. How very unfortunate that I should share a family name with them, then.
"So there's no relation?"
I would hardly be setting out tea things if my father were an earl. Camilla ducked her head. Now, if you'll excuse me.
"So you don't know Lady Judith Worth?"
Judith. A separate wash of forlorn desolation hit Camilla. Once, when she had been younger and even more stupid, her uncle had offered to take her in. Her and Judith and Benedict, and not their younger sister Teresa. She could scarcely recall why any longer. Something about Teresa being difficult. Camilla had said yes to the offer. He'd said she could have gowns, lemon tarts, and a come-out after all. Judith, her eldest sister, had tried to argue. He doesn't love us, her sister had told her. I won't starve, Camilla had responded, stupid at 12. It seemed a fitting punishment for Camilla that she'd been granted none of her wishes. Not the gowns, nor the come-out, nor the lemon tarts. She'd spent every year since yearning more and more desperately for the love she'd dismissed out of hand. She'd chosen to live without it. Still, somehow, the demons on her shoulder whispered that she might still have it. Some day.
Ah, the bishop said. You do know her.
Camilla hadn't seen Judith once in the years since. Judith had made it clear she was unwelcome. Camilla shook her head and spoke through the lump in her throat. I don't. How would I know the Marchioness of Ashford? A pause. She could feel her longing. an almost tangible presence in her chest. She'd heard the news about Judith's marriage shortly after Rector Miles had taken her in. He was the one who had impressed on her the seriousness of her misbehaviour. He had told her that she should not long to be loved so, that it would drive her to destruction. He'd told her that she hadn't earned the right to such care, that the impulse that welled up inside her, insisting that she might one day belong somewhere, was the devil trying to seduce her. Judith was married to a marquis of all things. It was what Camilla had dreamed about when she'd abandoned her family. Rector Miles was right. Camilla didn't deserve what Judith had. Still, she could not stop herself from dreaming. The bishop was watching her with a troubled air.
"You seem to know her well enough to know of her wedding. Interesting for someone who claims not to be related."
Camilla exhaled. Well, who doesn't follow the nobility? Particularly when one family, entirely coincidentally, shares one's name. He didn't sound as if he believed her. Rector Miles must have disclosed something of Camilla's past, if he knew her abandoned last name. She hated admitting the truth. She hated even thinking it. It really is the best that I'm no relation, don't you think?
Is it?
Well, what you've described. The treason. She swallowed. Lady Judith's new marriage. The family's position in society must be terribly precarious. She could hear her own voice shaking as she spoke. She pressed her hands into her skirts to stop them trembling.
"Is that so?"
She felt speared by his eyes. There was talk after the father and the brother had that incident, you know. People said the family was nothing but bad blood. He examined his fingernails.
"You do know quite a bit about them."
If people thought someone like me was related to the likes of them. Her whole being ached, just thinking of what it would mean. I imagine it would ruin whatever progress they've managed to achieve in society.
"Someone like you? What are you, then?"
What are you? Not who. He looked at her like a thing, and under his gaze she felt like one. The rector had made her say it, once when she arrived here. She knew she was flawed to her core. She didn't want to have to say it again. "Nobody," she whispered. "I'm nobody." The rector must have told Bishop Lassiter the truth, for him to subject her to this interrogation. He must have told him how he found her 18 months ago, kissing a footman she had no business kissing. Miles had impressed on her the consequences of her conduct. Rumour is, your younger brother is going to Eton now. Maybe the family name can be rehabilitated. Maybe. Maybe would be never, if the truth about Camilla ever came out.
"That whole business has nothing to do with you, then?"
No. She whispered the word hoarsely. Nothing.
"Camilla," said the rector, "I'm filling out my logbook for yesterday. Do you remember who I discussed?"
The relief she felt at the change of subject was immense, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She liked being helpful. She had an excellent memory, and she'd often assisted him by providing names. In the morning, before the bishop arrived, Mr. and Mrs. Watson, Miss Jones, Mrs. Landry. After the bishop, I wasn't about.
"Very well."
Oh, She paused. Wait. I do recall one name. Mrs. Martin. You discussed her while I was setting out the tea things.
He didn't smile at her. That's very helpful. You should endeavour to be helpful, Camilla. That's the only way you'll make progress.
Even that tiny amount of guarded praise had her glowing. In the years since she'd left her sister, she'd had little enough praise. Deservedly so. Camilla had that chorus of devils on her shoulder, and no matter how she sometimes felt about the rector, he'd made sure that any rumours of her would not harm her family. She had to remember that.
That will be all, Camilla.
She escaped, feeling scraped raw. Judas, it was said, betrayed Christ for 30 silver pieces. Camilla had sold her family for lemon tarts. It seemed fitting that she had nothing. In a parable or a Greek myth, she would have been doomed to yearn for love hopelessly forever. But this wasn't a parable or a myth, and that legion of devils on her shoulder still gave her more hope than her single angel. It's been bad, they whispered, but just hold on. Don't look back, look forward, and it will all come out right. Any day now. Just hold on to your hope. The rector had told her not to listen to that hope. It sounded sweet, he told her, but it would lead her astray. Foolishness, said her angel, but its voice was small in comparison. One day, said those devils, it will all be better one day. Camilla took a deep breath, shut her eyes, and tried not to believe her devils. As always, she failed. Camilla! The call came from below stairs. Camilla jumped. Camilla! Where are you? She came back to herself again and locked her bitter loneliness away. She tied it up with hope in the centre of her heart. With any luck, it wouldn't escape again. Not for a good, long while. Chapter 5. It had been 3 days since Adrian arrived in Rector Miles's household, and he still hadn't discovered what he needed. A substantial part of the problem. Being a valet was hard work, particularly since Adrian did not know how to be a valet. Now he had been told there was a red wine emergency. Adrian didn't have time for emergencies, he thought, dashing up the servant stair. What he wanted to do was finish the task his uncle had set to him. But Miss Winters had avoided him the entire second day he'd been there, blushing when their eyes met, looking pensive and thoughtful, as if she'd been reprimanded. The cook knew nothing. Miss Shackleton, the other maid, shook her head and said to speak with Miss Winters. It was all dreadfully inconvenient. The sooner he found evidence, the sooner he could quit, return to his uncle and be back about his business. More saliently, if he didn't find something soon, he was going to end up sacked. Possibly, he thought, as he arrived at the room where Lassiter was staying, he would get sacked today. He was absolute shite at being a valet, and his inexperience would be exposed at any moment. When he'd interviewed for the position, he'd promised he was a veritable genius at removing stains. It had been a lie. He knew nothing about removing stains. He knew how to make extremely vibrant stains that would bond with the surface of bone china upon application of heat and not come off, no matter what one did with the piece afterward. He had a wealth of expertise in dyes and metal oxides and glazes. Knowing about those processes had allowed him to construct realistic-sounding sentences
that bore absolutely no relation to reality. Luckily, there was one person who knew less about stain removal than Adrian, and it was Bishop Lassiter. The man had listened to Adrian make up some rubbish about vinegar and sunlight, and Adrian couldn't even remember what he had said. It had worked, though, which was a miracle. His lies rarely worked. But it wouldn't last. He'd just been told that the bishop had spilled red wine down his front at lunch and was waiting for him in his room. Adrian opened the door. A quick glance. Nobody in the chair, nobody standing at the window. Bed stripped of sheets. Strange. Lassiter would be up shortly, no doubt. Adrian crossed to the wardrobe, opened it, and started sorting through the clothing, looking for an appropriate change. The shirt the bishop had worn 2 days ago should have done, except it had been stained with mustard. Adrian had tried to launder it, but who knew mustard was so discolouring? Not Adrian. That yellow blotch would betray him. Damn! That left... His train of thought was interrupted by a noise on the other side of the room. He turned to see Miss Winters straightening, feather duster in hand. Of course. He should have realized someone else was here, with the linen piled in a white heap in the corner. Miss Winters had been avoiding him ever since that first night. She took a step back from him now, even though she stood on the other side of the room. They'd had almost 36 hours of monosyllabic exchanges, 36 hours of her almost looking at him before catching herself in the act and blushing. "My apologies for the interruption," Adrian said, "but I've been told the bishop will be up momentarily. He spilt something on himself at lunch." "No," Miss Winters frowned. "He didn't. But I cleared away the dishes an hour ago with him in the room. He didn't spill anything." Adrian frowned. "But I was told most specifically." He trailed off. Maybe it hadn't been at lunch, but red wine at lunch. What a specific thing to say, if it hadn't happened. From the back of his mind, intuition pushed a thought forward. Something was off. He'd also been told the bishop was already waiting in the room, and he wasn't. Ridiculous. It was just a miscommunication. That's odd. He turned. "I'll go see what this is about, then, and leave you." He reached for the door handle, pressing down. It resisted movement. He tried once again, yanking harder, but to no avail. That thought came back. Something was off. He frowned. No. There had to be an explanation. He turned back to Miss Winters. "The door is locked." Her eyes widened. She shook her head. "Why ever did you lock the door?" "I didn't lock the door." Well, she took another step away from him. Her back hit the wall. "Open it. Open it immediately. It's one thing for 2 servants to speak in a room with the door wide open. It's another for us to be locked in a bedroom together. It doesn't look good." She shook her head. "It doesn't look good at all. What are you waiting for? Open the door." "I can't," Adrian said. "I don't have a key." She shook her head. "Open it! Open the door!" He gave the door handle another frustrated wrench. "I can't. I don't know how to pick locks. Do you?" "No. How on earth would I know that? You're the valet." "Huh. What does that have to do with it?" "Valets are supposed to have a wide and varied skill set." "Not that wide." The door wasn't moving. "Not that varied." "Well," she gestured, "climb out a window, then. Do you know how this is going to look?"
He gave her an incredulous stare. "We're on the 3rd floor." "They already call me half-price Camilla." She wrung her hands. Her breath was growing shallow. "If they catch me with a handsome man locked in a bedroom, do you know what they'll call me?"
"Quarter price, Camilla?"
He'd been trying to lighten the mood. Apparently, that was not the way to do it. Her cheeks flushed crimson. "No!" She sounded close to tears. "They won't call me anything at all, because I'll be sacked. I have nobody. No references, no family, no money." "Something's off," Adrian's instinct whispered again, but there was nothing to do except— "Let's be calm," he suggested, "as the situation demands." Her nostrils flared. "I am precisely as calm as the situation demands."
"You're not calm at all."
"That is what the situation demands." She turned from him. "Very well. If you won't do it, I will. I'm going out the window." She wrenched at the handle. It resisted. "It's stuck." She looked over at him. "Help me! Help me!" He couldn't let her go out the window. She was breathing shallowly for one, and in skirts for another. To make matters worse, there were no helpful climbing vines on the outer wall, no convenient trees. She was going to break her neck, damn it.
"All right," he said calmingly. "I'll help. But we should talk about a real strategy, don't you think?"
He came up beside her. She was in the throes of panic. He wasn't entirely sure why. Surely, if they were found together, they could just tell the truth and be believed. "Stop talking," she said. "Start helping." She wouldn't let go of the little crank that opened the window, so he wrapped his hands around hers.
"Breathe,"
he said.
"On 3. 1, 2.
On 2 and a half, the door opened. The other maid, Miss Kitty Shackleton, if Adrian recalled correctly, stood in front, a keyring in her hand. Behind her stood Albert, the footman, Rector Miles, and Bishop Lassiter. A cold chill ran down Adrian's spine. Something was very much off, his instinct told him again, and this time he listened. Why were they all standing there? Why had so many people come up just to unlock a room? "There they are," said the maid, "holding hands." Miss Winters jumped 2 feet away from him. "The door was locked. We were trying to open a window to escape."
"Really?"
The rector strode into the room.
"Were you?"
It didn't sound like a question. Not the way he said it. Miss Winters answered anyway. "Nothing happened. We've only been here 5 minutes. You've been up here since you finished with the lunch things." Kitty folded her arms. "An hour ago."
"I've only been in here for 5 minutes,"
Adrian said.
"But, Hunter—"
It was Albert who spoke now. Albert, who, a scant 10 minutes ago, had claimed a red wine emergency.
"Hunter, you told me you were coming up here to air out the bishop's wardrobe an hour ago."
A sick feeling bloomed in Adrian's gut. Wrong. This was wrong. So wrong. He should have listened to his instincts the moment they whispered that something was off. "It's not true," Camilla whispered. "It's just not." Miss Shackleton stepped into the room, crossing over to stand by Miss Winters.
"This looks bad, Camilla."
The rector spoke in a low, soothing voice.
"We all know your past. We know you have terrible impulses, that you often give in to them."
Miss Winters turned crimson in ugly blotches.
"Is there some innocent explanation for why you spent an hour behind a locked door with a man?
It wasn't an hour, and neither of us have a key.
Miss Winters sounded on the verge of tears.
We couldn't have locked the door. You asked me for the spare key this morning, said Miss Shackleton. I didn't!
Miss Shackleton reached over, thrust her hand into Miss Winters' pocket, and pulled out a single key on a ring.
What is this, then?
It was like watching a farce play out, and not the funny kind either. Adrian could imagine how all this might seem, but he knew for a fact that she could not have locked the door. She had been here when he arrived, clear across the room from the entrance, feather duster in hand. She had been standing 4 feet from the lock when he'd first tried it. Adrian wasn't sure who in this room was lying, or why they were doing it, but he knew who wasn't. What the hell was happening?
Camilla,
the rector said in a sorrowful voice.
I trusted you when you said you would cease your immoral behavior. You've disappointed me.
Miss Winters started crying. Adrian just felt even more baffled. What was happening? Why?
She's been flirting with Mr. Hunter since he first arrived,
Miss Shackleton said, shaking her head.
I haven't, Camilla sobbed. I've been trying so hard to be good.
The truth, Camilla.
The rector's voice was calm.
I flirted a little, she admitted, the first day, but I did what you always told me to do. I noticed my behavior and I corrected it. Really, I did.
The real truth, Camilla.
She swallowed. Her eyes, shimmering with tears, shivered shut.
I flirted a lot the first day.
For God's sake, it hadn't been that much. But the rector shook his head.
Lying, deceit, licentiousness.
She let out another sob, and something in Adrian's chest snapped. He took a step forward.
This has been enough. I was here too. It happened precisely as she said. She's in tears. Have a little human kindness.
A silence swirled through the room.
So,
the rector said. There was a pregnant expectancy in the way he drew out the syllables.
You're willing to make it right?
Your pardon? Adrian said in further confusion.
Make what right? We'll discuss this in my office, the rector said. Kitty, conduct Camilla upstairs and lock her in the servants' quarters until her future is decided. As for you,
he gestured at Adrian. None of this made sense. Everything was off. Adrian knew Camilla hadn't locked the door, that he hadn't been in this room for the hour that they claimed. What on earth was happening? Then, behind the rector, he saw Bishop Lassiter. Adrian had been sent here to spy on the man for his uncle. That small, self-satisfied smile that touched the bishop's lips froze Adrian's blood. It was the only explanation he could think of. The bishop knew what Adrian was trying to do. He had tried to be careful. He hadn't contacted his uncle at all.